Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Recently, I heard about an article written by someone asserting that all religious laws today are outdated. The writer referenced a Muslim scholar who had said in a speech that some of the Islamic injunctions perhaps are outdated and must be revisited through Ijtihad, deductive reasoning, giving pretext to this writer to make such a claim. She added that all the rulings mentioned 14 centuries ago should be thrown out and, quote, we should be perhaps waiting for a new fate that fits our time. So the point brought up by this writer is twofold. One is that Islamic laws are outdated or irrelevant to today's needs. And the second one is whether Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last messenger. Today, we want to address the question on how do we understand the finality of Islamic laws and how these injunctions apply to modern times. How do we address those who think Islamic rulings are outdated? What are they missing? We will address the finality of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in another lecture, inshallah. We will also conclude on where do these assertions come from and the motivation behind them. I have already given a lecture titled Which Fate Should I Choose, in which the message of Islam was discussed, and another lecture called Sharia, in which Sharia law and its purpose was discussed in detail. Today, we want to talk about applicability and categories of Islamic laws and whether changes are needed. Regarding the Islamic laws and rulings, firstly, we believe that laws and rulings given in the Quran and the tradition are divine and permanent. God does not change his mind. Hence, Sharia framework and laws themselves do not change, but their applications, masadiq, change or expand. This includes subjects, institutions, and conditions which did not exist until recently, like insurance, banking, transplant, etc. Or there may be instances that the benefit or objective, maslahah, under which a ruling was made no longer exists or has changed. Then by default, ruling will change as well. Therefore, if there are any changes to be made, the Sharia itself will allow it without violating Islamic principles and objectives. No need to tamper with it. The jurists in the Islamic world meet on regular basis, consult, and use various methodologies to rule as to which parts are permitted and which parts are not. By grace of God, Islam is a timeless faith capable of addressing all questions, new applications, and needs of the time. Those who think otherwise have not diligently examined Islam, which is a comprehensive religion that not only has legislated rulings on the acts of worship and moral conduct, both of which are permanent, but has also legislated other aspects of life, especially on issues related to family, relationships, inheritance, social relations, man's rights, woman's rights, contracts, financial and punitive rules, and others, of course, most of which are expandable. Let's elaborate on this. Sharia has safeguards and concepts in place where under certain conditions, rulings and laws may change within its framework as long as its objectives are not violated. A simple example would be the ruling on fasting. As reflected in the Quran itself, while fasting is obligatory in month of Ramadan, if the person is sick or in travel, the ruling under this condition changes and he becomes exempt until he make up the missed days. Same with social issues and individuals dealing with the society. Another example is the concept of ownership in Islam, which is highly regarded, and anyone who earns a property or wealth in a permitted halal way, not stealing, etc., has the right to its ownership and use. However, while using it, if he harms others, the principle of la darar, no harm, will stop him. We have examples of this in the prophetic tradition. I have a full right to the fruit from my tree that sits right inside the fence between my property and my neighbor's yard. However, I forfeit the right if I must go through the neighbor's property, invading his privacy without his permission or agreement. Here, Islamic law allows it through principle of la darar, no harm, within itself, and without the need for us to impose changes. As the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, La darara wa la darara fil Islam. No harm should be done or received according to Islam. Islam limits things that cause harm or loss to other members of the society. Therefore, there are others. The principle of la haraj, no hardship, which is applied where there is unnecessary hardship in implementing something. There is also the principle of necessity, which takes precedence over general rulings, making it a special case when it becomes necessary. For example, eating something forbidden, like pork, becomes allowed in case of emergency to preserve life, when there is nothing else available to eat, as the Quran says, فَمَنْ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ. But if one is driven by necessity, not willful disobedience nor transgressing due limits, a necessity entails any ruling that is essential to protecting any of the Sharia objectives. Or in other words, without it, the objective will completely perish. Rulings can be made through concepts like necessity over rules forbidden. Lesser of the two evils should be chosen. Public interest takes precedence over the individual interest. Harm must be removed, etc., etc. The trouble comes when some respected so-called Muslim reformers or intellectuals want to change the Islamic law to a law based on common laws practiced in secular societies, ignoring the fact that in Islamic Sharia there is framework within which rules can change as long as ground rules are applied, so no need to change Sharia or abandon it. This way, there is no innovation, bid'ah. An example is what is commonly considered among the scholars and jurists, as they say, when the subject or objective changes, the ruling changes as well. In other words, the ruling follows the subject and objective. An example would be in pre-Islamic time, due to high degree of animosity and hate, they often used to dismember the body of the person after killing him. They would take out the heart or other part of the body, for example. Islamic law forbade such practice as it considers it desecration of the body. Plus, it hardens people's hearts. However, today, we know body parts can be donated and or taken out of dead body for medical research, all of which can be allowed by Sharia for this purpose or objective. In other words, while the action is the same, the objective has changed. No one removes parts for desecration of body anymore. Hence, ruling changed because the subject or the objective or the intention changed. Another change allowed by Islamic law is when the state of something prohibited is changed through applying a process where its property changes. Then the ruling changes. For example, when Alcohol, which is an intoxicant and forbidden to drink, goes through two-step process of fermentation from carbohydrate to an alcohol to an acetic acid, which is then fermented into vinegar. Its state changes, and vinegar is no longer an intoxicant. It becomes permitted. These are just few examples. The principles such as harm, hardship, necessity, or change of subject and objective allow Muslim jurists to reach a new ruling, fatwa, through processes available to them such as Ijtihad, deductive reasoning, qiyas, reason by analogy, and ijma', consensus, provided the new ruling is not in conflict directly or indirectly with the Quran and Sunnah, or at least captures the spirit of the relevant objective. These are the tools that scholars and jurists can use in order to issue rulings that become applicable as the environmental changes occur. Therefore, there is fallacy in claiming Islamic laws are inflexible. Even on the Sharia's penalty rulings, if the objective of the ruling is no longer accomplished, or any of the conditions for such ruling are not met, then the punishment may be changed to what is common per, Islamic court. Of course, here we are talking about a true Islamic government. On any subject where Islam is neutral or silent or agrees with the certain urf, common law, then there's nothing wrong with adopting such a law. All we're saying is that the solution is within the Sharia itself and within Muslims' reach. One needs to understand the Islamic fundamentals and principles by returning to the noble Quran first, which is the authority, and review the relevant verses and injunctions, which were sent down for all mankind for all times. The next step is to utilize the Sunnah in order to refine and detail these rulings, then as needed, use the mentioned principles and processes to create or expand the rulings in order to address the new applications. Those who want to go directly to the common laws and abrogate the Sharia laws do not know that the Quran says in chapter 2, none of our revelations do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten except we substitute something better or similar. Do not know that Allah has power over all things. So is Sharia expandable? From Sharia point of view itself, we know it allows it through what we call expansion of masadiq, or applications. An example, the principle of not harming others can be expanded. Harming others was common back in Prophet's time, but now there are many more ways people can harm each other or each other's interest, such as through media or internet with push of a button. The expansion in Sharia does not mean its fundamentals expand. Rather, its application, masadiq, expand. In Islam, there are laws which are fixed and final. And then there are rulings that as the human life and understanding evolves, they evolve as well. Then there are areas where Islam is silent and are left up to man's ingenuity to legislate, like certain civic laws. Some people do not understand this and say Sharia is rigid and old because it does not address today's needs or cannot be changed, hence it's inflexible. So let's go through more examples on a couple of hot topics commonly discussed. In the context of family, Islam aims to protect the institution of family. Hence, Just like any institution or company, it assigns a manager to it. As such, it gives certain rights that commensurate with the scope of this manager's responsibility. Islam charges man, the husband, with managing the family and financially taking care of the whole family, and the wife as his assistant manager. Of course, children being taken care of by both. Hence, the Quran says in chapter 4, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. Men are in charge of women, maintainer of women, by what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. Of course, this does not mean the man can be dictator and whatever he says must be obeyed without question. There's such a thing as mutual consultation between the husband and wife, which the Quran also talks about elsewhere. Some people say times have changed. Today we have women who work and support their families or help provide for their families, yet Islam says the man is in charge, like the old days. Hence, its inflexibility. Not true. Here, Islam is saying God has put men in charge of maintaining women and children in the family, and the reason is given, بِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ, and for what they spend for maintenance from their wealth or financial ability. There could be additional reasons such as physical strength, etc. The financial ability is mentioned because due to this role, whatever men earn must be spent to maintain the family. In Islam, whatever women earn or inherit is theirs, and she has no financial responsibility toward the husband and the family. This is the general rule or assignment by God. If you look at the statistics, even today in the Western world, not in the Middle Eastern country you might claim to be behind. For example, according to US Department of Labor, in 2019, 57.4% of all adult women participated in the labor force. By comparison, the labor force participation rate for men was about 70%, according to their data. And labor force participation varies by marital status and differs between women and men. Unmarried women had the highest participation rate of all women, and separated and divorced women were next, and their participation were respectively 63.7% and 60.8%. And then married women at 58.6%. So majority of the 57.4% overall working women seem to be single women supporting themselves and or their parents and siblings, followed by another percentage of them who were single mothers. Both categories are forced to work because they had no one else available to provide, so they are the sole provider as default. Hence, none of them are relevant to this discussion, but make up majority of the working women in the US. The next category of women who is relevant to this discussion are those who are married and working. The Labor Department lists them as separate category and says, quote, among married couple families, 53% had earnings from both the wife and the husband in 2018, which means in 47% of the families, men are still the sole provider, even in the US. Now, an interesting data which Department of Labor does not seem to have is what percentage of this 53% married couples where both are working, the wife works but does not have to. Back to our discussion. In special cases where a woman can provide by working and still meet her spousal and motherhood duties, in the case of children, of course, and she is willing to share her earnings to support the family, Islam does not stop her. She can do so if she's willing. Islam only assigns care to be the duty of the man as a provider for the family, as the norm, which is actually what we see commonly today in majority of societies, even the non-Muslim families. And that in Islam, whatever the wife earns belongs to her, and it's not her duty to share. However, Sharia does not block a woman from working and providing for the family if she wants to, and agreed between the husband and wife. There may even be cases where she is forced to work, like if the husband is destroying the family or is absent or laid off or disabled, does not make enough salary, perhaps cannot manage finances or cannot meet his responsibilities as head of the household in any way, then he forfeits it, and she will be the one to provide and manage. Hence, بِمَا أَنْفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ, what they spend for maintenance from their wealth in the verse will be hers in this case. In other words, it is about the responsibility and capability, physical, financial, or otherwise, not gender inequality. In Islam, men and women are equal human beings, but they do have different roles and physical and emotional attributes. One might say, well, the number of working women is increasing and there's a role reversal going on. To that, we say, yes, there are many working women today, especially in the Western world, many of whom to support themselves, since they are unmarried and not living with parents. If you take this percentage of working women who are breadwinners in the married couple families, according to statistics we mentioned, in majority of families, they are still head of households for men, providing for families. Even in the Western world, the gap is still there. And if and when the gap closes, the majority become women, then what we discussed will still be germane then. Of course, we can ask and discuss what are the social dynamics behind both husband and wife having to work or wanting to work. Plus, what are the implications of this role reversal in the society? But that is another discussion to be had. Another hot topic relevant to this topic, often discussed, is the ruling of the son inheriting twice the daughter. The critics say the Islamic law is sexist or belongs to old days and does not regard women equal to men. Wrong again. The same inheritance ruling says in cases where the deceased has children, the deceased father and mother inherit equal shares. So it is not about gender, rather, again, the financial responsibility and family management men have been charged with. As discussed, in the context of family, Islam wants to protect the institution of family. And just like any institution or company, it assigns a manager to it with certain right. Just like in a company where a manager gets paid more than his employees due to his bigger scope of responsibilities, here Islam assigns man, the husband, with managing the family and financially taking care of the whole family. And because of this assignment, he inherits twice his sister because he will be spending it on the family. The daughter of deceased receives half because in Islam she's financially responsible for herself only, or not even herself if she's married. So she gets to keep her inheritance to herself. whereas the son of the deceased is responsible for his family, such as his wife and children, his parents, siblings, and so on. So he does not get to keep his inheritance all to himself. Islam wants to preserve the family. Even in Western secular world today, people admit that the sanctity of family in the West has eroded, and families have fallen apart for not having such clear roles and responsibilities. Now, even in US, in some families, the mothers are quitting their high-paying jobs and staying home to take care of young children, if the family can afford it, of course, because they see its value outweighs the benefit of additional paycheck. Now, of course, there are exceptions which Islamic law has covered as well. For example, if the deceased knew his son is incapable of assuming his responsibility, perhaps he has addiction problem, mental problem, or is irresponsible, and if he's given 2 times inheritance, he will squander it away fast. While his daughter is a responsible person with a family in need, then he can gift her, while he's alive, whatever portion he feels she deserves. The deceased can even gift his home to the child in need with a stipulation that he can live in it while he's alive. There are built-in stipulations throughout Sharia. Now, if the roles are reversed and women become the head of household for the reasons we mentioned earlier, then they will be expected to spend not just their inheritance, but also their entire paychecks to support the family. That is a conversation, an agreement the husband and wife can have amongst themselves. So when those who say Islamic law of 14 centuries ago is inflexible and does not meet today's conditions, or it should follow the conditional changes, we say we do not agree with the statement that Islamic laws should follow and obey the conditions, but rather say that certain Islamic rulings follow the maslahah, wisdom or objectives. But then there are exceptions where the objectives change or may not apply anymore. Then ruling changes. In other words, Islam itself changes its rulings by allowing for special cases and stipulations, not people imposing their ruling on Islam. One might ask, well, people often have different interpretation of the text. A prime example would be the literal, strict, and narrow interpretation of groups like Daesh, ISIS, versus more realistic and contextual interpretation of others. Who is to say which one is right? This goes back to nature of human and his intentions, which is to interpret anything, any ideology according to his own interest. While both China, Russia, and few Eastern European countries claimed to be Marxist, each had their own interpretation of Marxism. Karl Marx himself had a single thought, but others had their own interpretation according to their own interest. In politics, especially in democratic societies, you have multiple parties competing and having their own interpretation of certain legislations and how the government should be run, each with their own candidates. Same with interpretation of religious text. For example, those with harsh and hostile intention will take verses which talk about fighting the disbelievers who fight you and generalize them to apply to all times and all situations. Fight us or not, we must attack and destroy them. Interpretations in all levels, and most extreme of them become groups like ISIS. Then there's second group, thank God, in the majority, who are moderate, fair-minded, educated, and do not interpret the text with preconceived notions. Read further, reflect, and contextualize before rushing to judge. And then reach a rational understanding that those of the disbelievers who are not fighting you, and there is an implicit or explicit peace treaty between you and them, you don't fight. When they are not with you nor against you, you don't fight them either. So, again, for those who do not impose their own ideology and agenda onto the text, the meaning of the text is and should be the same. Often, the reason for variety of interpretation is various assumptions and opinions some people might have. Hence, would like to see their assumptions validated through the Quranic verses. This results in opinion-based interpretations, which Islam warns against. Those who do, they are interpreting their own opinion, not the text. The main question becomes, among these groups, who is going to be the successful and enter paradise? Being successful requires sincerity of intention and motive. Once one has this sincerity, then his shortcoming will be forgiven and he will be successful. This, in fact, is true for their life as well in this life. Those who are sincere in their intentions and motives tend to be the successful and in peace. In the Quran, we see several verses about people who differed amongst themselves rebelliously after the clear evidence came to them, as it says, and none differed over the scripture except those who were given it after the clear proofs came to them out of their own animosity. With such people, you usually see contradictions and inconsistencies in their actions. They go along with something as long as it is not against their own interest. But as soon as something goes against their interest, they will try to go around it by giving baseless opinion and interpretation. Many of them do not even think about the root cause or objective of certain law. So we have different categories of rulings. Some are moral-based, which the human intellect already recognizes their benefits or harms. Islam just affirms them. Then we have rulings that are obedience or worship-based, and one obeys it without having to necessarily know the wisdom. When Islam says Allah enjoins justice, it is a command to be just, which is a moral ruling. Intellect, aql, says the same thing. So the wisdom or objective behind it is clear. But when Allah commands us to pray 3 rak'ah at sunset, it is an act of worship which we accept and perform. But could it have been 4 units, for example? Perhaps, however, God says it must be 3, and that's it. No apparent reason behind 3 versus 4 is needed. Or you make tawaf 7 times around Kaaba, not 9. It is an act of obedience. Our intellect might not know the reason or wisdom, but it is not against it, or it does not consider it an irrational act either. What is against intellect and considered irrational is as if Islam says 2 times 2 is 10. What our intellect would say is that I understand 3 units of prayer at sunset is a required act of worship, but I do not know the wisdom behind 3 verses 4. However, because the one we are worshiping says to worship him this way, we hear and obey. Hence, there are rulings that our intellect might not understand, but does not reject them as irrational either. We know they have their own objectives, but we may not fully understand them. Then there are some Islamic rulings in which the wisdom may not readily be apparent. Just like when a child is told by his parent to stop playing and go study, he does not know the eventual wisdom and benefit of studying and prefers to play, which is more fun, but knows the parent cares and is not his enemy. As such, he would not say, my father is not being sensible. He might say, I don't know the benefit and wisdom behind having to study, but I know my dad cares and loves me and has my best interest in mind. That is how some divine laws may be perceived by us, as we might not understand the immediate wisdom and benefit, but do not think they are irrational either. Of course, majority of the divine laws do resonate with our intellect and our nature. Hence, we do understand the wisdom and benefit behind it. All religion does puts its signature on it, like many moral injunctions. Even for new rulings, fatwa, Muslim scholars and jurists go through an intellectual process by using methodologies we mentioned earlier, like qiyas, reason by analogy, or ijtihad, deductive reasoning. So let's expand on this intellectual aspect a bit more. Interestingly, in the Quran, we have many verses that include intellect, aql, not as a noun, rather as a verb, which means having intellect is not the criterion, rather using the intellect is. Like asking, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, do you not use your mind, or do you not understand? Or وَقَالُوا لَا كُنَّا نَسْمَعُ نَعْقِلُ مَا كُنَّا فِي أَصْحَابِ السَّعِيرِ. And they will say, if only we had been listening or using our mind, we would not be among the companions of the blaze. So, as a verb, any intellectual thinking or using one's mind entails rational thinking, reasoning, bringing evidence. As in many places in the Quran says, bring your proof, your reason, if you are telling the truth. In other words, reason and proof is the basis for the truth. Therefore, we cannot say aql itself is the criteria. It's rather using it. Rational thinking becomes the criteria. One might have aql, but not use it. Furthermore, if you say intellect is the criterion, it becomes relative. One might ask, whose intellect? Einstein's or an ordinary person with high school education? Intellect at what age? 25, 50, 60? However, when intellect is used by someone to think and come up with a logic and reason, it could come from a child, a middle-aged or old person, a genius or an ordinary person, anyone. A logical evidence can be brought by a 15-year-old or a 50-year-old. When it makes sense, it is accepted. Logical reasoning is based on several things. Effects, number one, effects of results of something. An example would be forbidding wine, which results in intoxication. And the Quran says its harm is greater than its benefit. The harm is obvious, and we now know more about it than before, about its harm. All makes logical sense. Experience confirms it as well. When we see something's harm, both physical and spiritual, then we should avoid it. Number two, aql is not constant. It evolves over time based on the available information and environmental changes. Aristotle's intellect and thinking is different than that of Einstein's. The baseline of intellect may be common for everyone, what we call fitra, but the intellectual knowledge is different. The information processing is different from one person to the other. A ruling must be analyzed first with what is common between all mankind, as in fitra, nature, then with available information. Intellect will analyze and process based on the common knowledge available at the time. If that knowledge is wrong or incomplete, then the result of analysis will be wrong or incomplete. So the important thing to recall is that mankind's relation with nature, with his surroundings, and with himself is continuously changing. Hence, his knowledge is changing. It's not his intellectual reasoning at fault, rather, he analyzes based on available information. So when people come up with their own interpretation of text, one needs to investigate. What is the objective? Does it come from a divine revelation or merely someone's opinion? Because divine laws are not based on our limited knowledge, rather based on the Creator's absolute and unlimited knowledge. Another important point to remember is that one does not ask a religious scholar about physics or other physical science. He's not the expert. By the same token, while many scientists believe in God, does not mean they are expert in theology and can issue a religious ruling. Back to the laws, there are, of course, civil laws of the land that were created to establish order in the society and do not involve Sharia. For example, trade laws, traffic laws, etc., many of which Islam has left for humans to figure out and legislate. Even in mu'amalat, transactions, Sharia only rules on what is forbidden, like usury, but does not get into topic of how to invest or marketing strategies. It encourages investing by lawful means, of course, but leaves the how-tos to people's creativity. The purpose of Sharia is to make humans better human beings, make them morally righteous human beings. As a result, produce better societies where liberty and justice flourish. In Sharia, everything has rights. You have rights as individual. God has rights. Others in the community have rights. Hence, Sharia aims to fulfill these rights, to take care of obligations and establish justice in the society. It tells us what is obligatory and what is forbidden, and leaves all in between permissible, which is a big range to choose from, without being negligent or wasteful, of course. People who do not adopt God's laws and limits can go to extremes, like giving too much freedom on one extreme and taking people's freedom away in another extreme. Islam balances the life of individuals as well as the society among all available choices. It is therefore our belief that Islam is the last and final message from God, and all the explicit and implicit rulings are final. In fact, when verse 3 in chapter 5, in which it was revealed, Al-Yawm akmaltu lakum dinakum, today I have completed your religion, the message of Islam was completed. Hence, even if the Prophet, peace be upon him, lived several more years, the book of God would have been completed the same time as it did. Keep in mind, different things happen in different times, but certain laws are fixed and general in nature. The laws of la darar, no harm, for example, is permanent, but its application changes, as there are now more ways to harm someone or something. In most cases, shara ruling is based on harm and benefit. Those of which are beneficial or have no harm are permitted. Those of which are harmful or their harms outweigh their benefit are forbidden, like drinking alcohol, which has many health, family, and social harms. Most of these harms and benefits are apparent and make sense to anyone. However, some people choose to ignore them and want to do whatever they want to do. Like a doctor who knows all about the harms of smoking, yet keeps smoking. So some people do not consider the real objective, maslahah, behind certain laws. Let's take an example, like marriage contract. Some people, especially in the West, don't know or choose to ignore the objective or benefit behind marriage and think when a man and a woman decide to live together, it is the same thing as marriage, getting married, as long as they mutually agree to do so, of course. They think the only condition is the agreement between two adults. In Islam, agreement is one of the conditions. The other condition must also be met, which is the act itself must be proper and approved. Living together without the commitment marriage contract brings, it is not a proper or approved act in Islam, even if there is mutual consent. There is mutual consent in gambling between the two parties or in homosexual relationships. Yet, they are not approved acts. By the way, in the secular world, many of these acts may be legally adopted and approved. Here in the US, we have domestic partnership, where two people can legally live together, a man and a woman, or same sex, with rights equal to marriage. The homosexual marriages are also recognized as legal and binding. On the other hand, cheating on one's spouse and extramarital affairs, while morally condemned, are not against the law. Why all this? Because when the legislators, who are people's representatives, see people want something, even though it may not be sensible or morally proper, they will still proceed to legalize because they feel obligated and want their constituents' votes for the next round of election. Therefore, in this sense, legality of something does not necessarily mean it is the right thing to do. Divine faith and its laws are like a doctor who will prescribe a medicine that is proper and results in well-being of the patient, whether it tastes good or not. Islam prescribes what is proper and beneficial in the interest of society and its members. As the Quran says in chapter 17, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And we reveal of the Quran that which is healing and a mercy for believers. At the end, let's be frank. It's not the Islamic ruling that is deficient and in need of reform, nor the need for new religion and new laws. It is rather people who want to deviate from their God-given nature, submit to their desires, hence want a religion that aligns itself with their desires, without any restrictions and obligations. They want to be free to indulge in anything they wish, large or small, in all levels, without any limits. And, in the West, because there is advancement in science and technology, unfortunately, people consider any improper or unapproved act as a sign of progress and modernity. While advancement in technology has its own place, benefit, and applications, improper acts are improper regardless of how advanced a society may be. Even many great Western thinkers and speakers have warned against the moral decay in the Western societies, all in the name of freedom. Of course, in order to have the support of their people, legislators, lawmakers cooperate, approve, and adopt laws that lead to such societal erosion. In the meanwhile, people in the third world countries, like in the Muslim countries, witness these cultural changes or so-called progress and are influenced, thinking whatever comes from the West must be good and okay to import, as if it's a cell phone, computer, car, or an airplane. Then these practices enter into minds of our young adults and gradually become the norm. As a result, you see some of these countries with deeply rooted religious identities claiming to be Islamic, yet their new generation is confused and pulled in two directions between what they call modernity and their own religious teachings and identity on the other side. Now, more than ever, it is time for the religious and secular leaders in this country to wake up, put their differences aside, unite, and strategize on how to advance their countries while keeping their identity. Making progress does not mean abandoning religious identity and moral values. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.